They say weddings bring people together, but sometimes they just show you how far apart you've drifted. I wore that pale rose dress I'd been saving for years, baked the banana bread he always loved, even pressed the cardigan with the tiny pearl buttons he once said made me look like one of those classic TV moms. But when I stepped into the wedding hall and saw there was no seat saved for me near him, something inside me quietly shifted, and I knew right then that shift would change everything. Spring in northern Vermont is still and heavy. Not the peaceful kind of still, but the kind that feels like you've been forgotten. My little house sits near a quiet lake, surrounded by old pine trees and long memories. I live alone now. My husband, Frank, passed away 4 winters ago. Our son Eric calls less and visits even less than that. But I get it. That's what we raised them for, right? So they can go live their own lives. Lately my days move slow. I bake in the morning, drink lukewarm coffee over the local paper, and water the row of stubborn tulips out front that still refuse to bloom. Some afternoons I sit and watch the mail truck drive by without stopping. And sometimes I wonder if it's stopping for someone else down the road, someone who checks their box and pretends they're not hoping either. 3 weeks ago Eric called. Said he was getting married. He sounded excited but rushed. He said her name was Katie. When I asked about the wedding he mentioned something simple but elegant, then drifted off. He didn't ask when I might be free or if I had thoughts. I offered to help, maybe bake a pie for the rehearsal dinner. He said that was sweet but they had it all covered. After we hung up I stared at the phone for a long time. It felt like I'd just been given a part in a story I thought I helped create. But now I was just a guest. So I chose hope. Picked out my dress, swept the porch, even hemmed the sleeves of my coat. A part of me still believed maybe, just maybe, this wedding could bring us closer again. But sometimes the worst kind of loss doesn't come with slammed doors or harsh words. It comes in soft shrugs and quiet exclusions. The kind that follows you into bed at night and makes you wonder when you stopped mattering. The wedding was 2 hours south, at a fancy lakeside resort with high wooden beams and massive windows that looked out over the water. Eric said Katie picked it. She wanted something modern that still felt timeless. I arrived early like always. Wore the dress I'd kept carefully pressed, soft pleats at the waist, nothing too bold. Hair pinned back, light lipstick. I thought I looked like what a mother should look like at her son's wedding. The front desk girl gave me a name tag and smiled like I was a stranger. It said, Diane Morris. No mother of the groom. No ribbon. Nothing like what the bride's family wore. Inside, small groups were already forming, laughter floating above the soft background music. Waiters walked through with champagne and tiny fancy appetizers. I saw Eric near the front with Katie, surrounded by people I didn't know. He didn't see me. One of the planners, a young guy with a headset and tight pants, waved me toward a table in the far back. The front tables had little signs: groom's coworkers, bride's family, maid of honor's parents. Mine just said, Diane. No last name. No title. I was seated between a man who sold insurance and a woman who raised alpacas in Colorado. They were polite, but they'd never met Eric. They chatted over me the entire night. During the toasts, the mic went from Katie's dad to her brother to an old roommate from college. They joked about tequila, shared memories from summer camp. Someone even asked when the groom's mom would speak. Katie laughed and said, maybe later, then moved right along. Dinner was quiet, served by course. I had the chicken. It was dry. No one at my table finished theirs either. The lemon tart for dessert looked better than it tasted. One bite and it left me feeling more bitter than sweet. Eric never stopped by my table. Not once. He danced with Katie, then her mom, then an older woman I didn't know. I waited. Smoothed my dress 3 times. Even smiled at the photographer who passed me twice and never lifted his camera. By the end of the night I was sitting alone in that rented chair, surrounded by half-cleared plates and guests already on their way to the parking lot. I folded my napkin carefully, slipped it under the rim of my glass and left. No one said goodbye. No one even looked up. A week went by before Eric called. He said he wanted to have me over for dinner. Just the 2 of us. Katie would be out with friends. His voice sounded cheerful, but there was something careful underneath. I could tell Eric was trying to sound casual, but it didn't fool me. I told him I'd come, didn't ask any questions. That evening, I slipped on the same soft cardigan I'd worn the day I brought him home from the hospital. It still fit snug around my wrists. I baked a batch of oatmeal cookies, wrapped them in foil and headed out. The drive was quiet. Roads dry. The sky hung heavy and gray, like winter wasn't quite done yet, no matter what the calendar said. Eric's new place sat in a neat subdivision at the edge of town. Red brick, trimmed hedges, matching porch lights, and a doorbell camera blinking like a watchful eye. He opened the door with a polite smile and gave me a quick hug that barely touched my shoulders. Told me dinner was in the kitchen. But when I stepped in, there was no smell of food, no clatter from the stove, just a table set for two, a bottle of wine already opened, and a small stack of papers placed neatly beside the plates. The documents were clipped, organized, and topped with a blue pen resting at an angle like an invitation. Eric poured wine, complimented the cookies, asked about the drive. His tone felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. Then he gestured toward the papers. Said it was just in case, something for peace of mind if anything happened to me. Just a basic power of attorney, he said. Everyone was doing it these days. He talked about it like the weather, dry, factual, detached. I nodded and reached for the folder. The first page was stuffed with legal jargon, but the message was clear. Financial control, real estate access, immediate authority, no expiration. It didn't say son. It didn't say family. It said agent. It said full control. Eric smiled and said there was no rush, but the pen was already uncapped. That's when I noticed the plates, completely empty. No dinner. Just the wine. Just the paperwork. Just the quiet pressure behind his friendly voice. I set the packet back down and told him I'd take it home to read. He nodded and reached for his glass. His eyes flicked from the pen to my face, but he didn't push. He didn't have to. His silence already said enough. After that, we talked about nothing. Weather, a neighbor's new fence, some TV show I'd never heard of. When I stood to leave, he walked me out, gave me another hollow hug. This one was even lighter than the first. I sat in the car for a while before starting the engine. The cookies sat untouched on the seat beside me. After a minute, the porch light shut off. Motion sensor. Efficient. Automatic. Just like the dinner. When I got home, I didn't bother changing. Still had my coat zipped halfway, shoes on, hands folded in my lap like they weren't mine. The house felt still, too still. Even the kitchen clock had stopped ticking. I wasn't sure I was even breathing. Eventually, I stood and went down to the basement. My knees ached with each step. The air was cold, damp, the kind that settles deep in old wood. Behind the washing machine, under a dusty shelf of paint cans, there was a cabinet. I knelt down and opened it. Inside sat a small metal box I hadn't touched since Frank died. He always said if anything ever happened to him, I'd find what I needed in there. I never had a reason to check until that night. The lid creaked open. Everything inside was in perfect order, just like Frank kept it. Folders neatly stacked, labeled and clipped. At the very bottom was a letter with my name on it in his handwriting. Just seeing it made my chest tighten. The letter was short, just a few lines. He said he knew I'd never ask for help even if I needed it. Said he'd arranged everything so I'd never feel trapped or dependent. And then he added not to tell Eric, not out of spite but because he knew how people changed. That money doesn't always corrupt. It sometimes reveals. Inside the folders were 2 bank accounts in my name, a whole portfolio of investments, stocks, mutual funds, and an annuity tied to a property in Arizona. The total? Over $7 million. I stared at the number. Closed the folder. Then opened it again, thinking I must have read it wrong. But I didn't cry. Not then. I didn't feel relief either. What I felt was something weightier, like carrying a truth too big for one room. I sat there on the cold basement floor, that box still open beside me, and all I could feel was the weight of what Frank had left behind. Not just the money but the trust. The foresight. The quiet protection I never realized I needed. Until that moment. He saw what was coming, long before I did. In his own quiet way, Frank hadn't just left me security or money. He left me something more valuable. The power to choose. I locked the metal box, stood up on shaking legs and made my way back upstairs. The kitchen light stayed on while the rest of the house dimmed. I sat at the table with a blank notepad and the folder Eric had handed me. I didn't write what he wanted. I wrote what needed to be said. 2 days later, the phone rang mid-morning while I was still in my slippers, settling in with a bowl of cereal. It buzzed once, then again. I let the first call go to voicemail. The second I answered. Eric's voice was smooth, almost too polished. He said he was just checking in, wanted to know if I'd looked through the papers. I told him I had. My voice stayed even. There was a pause, just a breath too long, before he said it wasn't urgent, but getting things settled, just in case, would be smart. I asked what he meant by that. He circled around vague points, planning, being practical, keeping me protected. He mentioned a woman on the news who lost access to her accounts after a stroke. Then brought up a friend's mother who forgot her passwords. I could hear the strategy beneath the concern. The reasons weren't about love, they were about leverage. When I didn't answer, he cleared his throat. Said he only wanted what was best, but there was a hint of pressure in his voice now. He said if we waited too long it might be harder to arrange things. Said the smart thing would be to sign now while I still could. I watched a squirrel dart through the bare yard, disappearing into a patch of brush. That's when I felt something tighten deep in my chest. I told him I'd think about it. He said okay, then casually added that Katie had found a financial advisor who could help set everything up. Said they'd make it easy. We hung up. I didn't move for a long while. My cereal sat untouched. I stared at it, soggy and cold. And I thought about the nights I held Eric when he was sick. The time I drove 5 hours in a snowstorm to bring him a tire. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. That was what love looked like to me. But now, he was talking to me like I was a spreadsheet. A task. The house felt smaller. The silence felt tighter. I got up, dumped the cereal, ran the tap until every trace of milk vanished. Then I opened the drawer by the fridge and pulled out the manila envelope, the one holding everything Frank left me. I held it for a while. It didn't feel like protection yet. It felt like the last stone in something he had quietly built for me. But now it was my turn to build something of my own. Not out of spite, just because even love has limits. And I had finally found mine. It took me 3 days to decide. Not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted the silence to mean something. I didn't want to act from pride or fear. I wanted clarity. I found Carol's number written on the back of an old birthday card. She'd worked in trusts and estates before retiring. We hadn't spoken since her husband passed, but I remembered something she once told me. The quietest women often leave the deepest marks. She picked up on the first ring. Her voice was slower but still sharp. I explained everything. She didn't react, just listened. Then she said we should meet. No judgment. Just coffee and truth. I went over the next afternoon. Her house was warm and small, filled with books and handmade quilts. I gave her the envelope. She read each page with the focus of someone who's read too many things too late for too many people. When she finished, she looked at me and said I had more power than I thought. That the money was secure, the investment solid, but only if I kept them that way. She asked if I wanted to form a trust. I said yes. Then she asked who I'd name. I told her, no one. Not yet. Maybe never. She didn't blink. Just nodded. Then she asked for Eric's papers. I handed them over. She skimmed them quickly, calmly, and said the language was aggressive. Full access, immediate control, zero oversight. These weren't written to care for me, they were written to absorb me. We rewrote everything. Every account was shifted into a private trust, locked down with conditions no one could bypass. Carol added a medical clause. 2 independent doctors would have to confirm loss of capacity before anyone gained control. Then she handed me the pen. I signed slowly, not out of fear but because I was finally setting a boundary. One I should have drawn years ago. That signature, just one quiet line across the page, spoke louder than any conversation. It said, I'm not invisible. I'm not your convenience. I'm not yours to manage. When we finished, Carol tucked the documents into a thick folder and told me to store them somewhere close but discreet. I slid them behind a box of dishwasher pods under the kitchen sink, where no one ever looks. Driving home, the world felt different. Not lighter but clearer, like someone had cleaned the lens of my life. And for the first time in ages, I didn't feel like a forgotten parent. I felt like a woman who had drawn a line and meant it. The next message came by text. Eric said he wanted to try again. Just dinner this time, no documents, no pressure. I waited a few hours before replying with one word. Sure. I didn't tell him I wouldn't be coming alone. Carol met me a block away and parked across the street. We agreed she'd stay nearby, only come in if needed. I wasn't nervous anymore. I'd learned how to be still without being soft. Eric opened the door, smiling, warm, casual, wearing a button-down and socks like he was trying to look familiar, like the boy who used to race barefoot through the halls. The kitchen smelled like garlic and roasted vegetables. Real food this time, or at least the illusion of it. We sat, chatted a little. He asked if I'd read anything lately. I mentioned a mystery novel from the library. He nodded but didn't ask what it was about. His eyes kept shifting toward a side table where another set of papers waited, stacked and clipped, different in detail but not in purpose. When he finally reached for them, his voice slowed. He said he'd talked to someone in elder law that this version was simpler. Nothing binding, just provisional. Just to make things smoother. He pushed them toward me. I didn't touch them. Instead, I slid out a folded paper of my own and laid it gently on top. Then I took a sip of water. No words, just paper meeting paper. He blinked, confused at first, then unfolded it. A legal trust execution. My signature at the bottom. Full asset transfer into private protection. Revocable only by me. His face stayed calm but his eyes didn't. They blinked harder and his jaw shifted like he'd bitten into something sour and was trying to smile through it. I spoke gently. I said I appreciated his concern. That I understood planning was part of being responsible. But mine was already done. Everything was final. He asked if I'd gotten advice. I said yes, from someone who understood what protection meant without pressure. The room went still. He leaned back, tapping the table once, then stopping. In that moment he didn't look like my son. He looked like a man who realized the door had just closed. That's when Carol entered, calm and kind. She smiled, greeted him and introduced herself, then said we'd be leaving now. I stood, gathered my coat and followed her without looking back. Outside the wind had picked up. I let out a breath that had been building for weeks. It wasn't anger, it was release. I wasn't walking away hurt anymore. I was walking away certain. The next morning was colder than expected. That kind of chill that gets into the floorboards. I made toast, poured orange juice, then sat down and didn't touch either. My hands were still warm from the night before but my chest felt closed. Around 10 a.m. my phone buzzed. One message. Just one line from Eric. You made this harder than it had to be. No greeting. No name. Just that. I stared at the screen for a long time, then set it face down on the table. The toast was cold. The juice looked dull. There was no follow-up, no apology. And I knew, like only a mother can, that his words weren't about pain. They were about control. About a door he thought would always stay open, now locked. Later that day I walked out to the garage and opened a few old boxes I hadn't touched in years. I found the photo albums. One page held a picture from a snowy Christmas. Eric at 5 years old, cheeks pink, holding up a toy truck, grinning so wide you could count the gaps in his teeth. That smile used to carry me through fear, through exhaustion, through everything. But now looking at it again, I saw something else. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a boy who'd always gotten what he wanted without asking twice. And Frank and I had let that happen. Not because Eric demanded it, but because we believed love meant making everything easy, clearing every hurdle. We gave too much. And somewhere along the way he mistook that generosity for entitlement. That afternoon I got a text from Katie. She said she was sorry things had gotten tense, that they were only trying to plan responsibly, and if I ever wanted to talk she'd be there. Then came the line that lingered longer than I expected. You raised a strong son. We just wanted to support his future. I read it twice. It sounded polite, polished, but underneath I heard it clearly. You've had your time. Let go. I didn't answer. I set the phone down and left it on the counter. That night I poured the orange juice down the drain. Not out of spite, just because I no longer wanted something that had gone cold. I stood by the window in the dark, the sky already tucking winter in over the rooftops. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I just stood there, because sometimes the clearest answer is silence. And when a door closes, it's not always meant to be reopened. Not with guilt, not with love, and certainly not just because of blood. Even when Frank was alive, the house had never been loud. But now, after that last exchange with Eric, the quiet felt different. It didn't feel neutral anymore. It felt like a decision. I moved slowly through the rooms, not from exhaustion but because nothing needed hurrying. My days took on a soft routine. I folded towels with care, wiped down already clean counters, watered my plants at the same time each morning. I wasn't waiting for a call, but I still noticed when it didn't come. 3 days later, the voicemail light blinked. I let the call ring out, but I listened afterward. Eric's voice came through the speaker like it was coming from behind a closed door I no longer planned to open. He said he'd overreacted, that he just wanted to make sure everything was in order. Then more quietly he said he missed how things used to be. Said he hoped we could talk. Just talk. I didn't delete the message. I didn't save it either. I let it sit there, somewhere between memory and obligation. That night I found myself scrolling through old messages I hadn't looked at in months. There were pictures from summers long past. Eric grilling in the backyard, Katie holding the pie I'd helped her make, the old dog asleep on the porch. And farther back, when Eric still used too many exclamation points. When he still ended texts with, "Love you." I paused on one and just stared, not trying to feel anything, just remembering. Then I began deleting the thread. Not in anger. In acceptance. The last thing I kept was a video. Eric at 10, flashlight under his chin, telling a spooky story in the dark. I could hear my own laugh in the background. Younger. Softer. I watched it twice, then closed my phone. That night I went to bed early, not to sleep but just to lie still. The bed didn't feel emptier. Just more honest. I had given that child everything. And the man he became had turned that love into leverage. That was the hardest truth. Not the greed. Not the manipulation. But realizing that what I gave freely had been twisted into something that could be used against me. At some point I'd stopped being his mother and become his asset. That's a kind of grief no one warns you about. A grief that sounds like your own voice echoing through an empty room saying nothing back. I moved in late February, just before the snow gave up. The new house wasn't far, still near the lake but tucked deeper into a quieter street. Smaller, older. A crooked mailbox. Shutters that rattled when the wind rolled in off the water. But it felt right, like a place made for someone who didn't need space to entertain anymore, just space to exhale. I brought only what mattered. A photo of Frank on the shelf. Smudged recipe cards. A few favorite books. My chipped blue kettle. And the ceramic owl that once sat by the garden and never scared a single bird. Most mornings I walked to the library on Main Street. Not because I needed books but because I liked the sound of pages turning nearby. I picked up a few shifts at the front desk. Nothing official, just enough to feel useful. Enough to keep my hands busy, away from things that no longer reached back. That's where I met them, the women who showed up each week. Not loud. No matching jackets. No cliques. They came in quietly, one by one, and stayed longer than necessary. Some read. Some wrote. Some just stared out the window like they were waiting on something that had already passed. There was Helen, who used to run a diner and now made quilts from her late husband's shirts. June always brought peppermint tea in a dented thermos with her sister's initials scratched into the side. Margot walked with a cane she barely used, except when she got near the door, like she needed it more for memory than balance. We didn't become friends right away. It happened slowly, over shared tea, quiet nods at the same bookshelf, and the unspoken understanding that we didn't need to explain what we'd lost, just that we kept showing up. One afternoon, Margot asked if I'd help with the garden bed behind the library. I said yes before I even looked. The soil was dry, packed hard by winter. It resisted us the way land does when left alone too long. But we turned it anyway, one row at a time, knees in the dirt, hands stained. No small talk. Just the rhythm of women planting something that might bloom later. We planted tomatoes, basil, and a few sunflowers just to be defiant. We called it the quiet corner. And it became ours. We rarely talked about our children. When we did, it wasn't bitter. It was like remembering a scar in the moment before it split the skin. What we shared wasn't grief. It was clarity. A sense of finally belonging, not to each other but to ourselves. In that space, with dirt under our nails and books nearby, I stopped feeling like someone's leftover. I started feeling like a woman again, present, rooted, and finally ready to grow. It was a Saturday morning when I saw him again. I had just swept the porch. The wind was sharp, but sunlight had finally broken through after days of gray. I was turning to go inside when I noticed a car parked out front. Not a stranger's. Just one shape I knew too well, still and heavy behind the wheel. Eric didn't move right away. When he did, he walked slower than I remembered, like someone who'd thought too much the night before. No polished clothes. No clipboard. Just jeans, a hoodie, and a plain white envelope in his hand. He didn't knock. He just sat on the porch steps, same spot he used to sit in as a boy waiting for dinner. Shoulders curled. Eyes lowered. I opened the door, walked out, and stopped a few feet away. He looked up, same eyes, just quieter. He said he was sorry. Said he let the money speak louder than love. Said it hadn't turned out the way he thought. Then he held out the envelope. I didn't take it, not yet. He said he didn't expect anything, just wanted me to know that he saw it now. What he'd done. What it had cost. I let the silence stretch. Then I sat beside him. Not close. Not far. Just enough for the porch to creak beneath us both. I told him I forgave him. But I also told him forgiveness didn't come with a key. Some doors once closed need time before they open again, if they ever do. He didn't argue. He just nodded. We sat there a little longer. A bird hopped across the sidewalk like we weren't even there. Then he stood, said thank you, placed the envelope gently beside me and walked to his car. I didn't wave. Didn't call after him. I just watched. When the car turned the corner and disappeared, I stayed. Not grieving. Not waiting. Just breathing. Because sometimes the first real step forward isn't moving. It's knowing how to sit still without being pulled under. The first snow came early that year, thin and hesitant, like it hadn't made up its mind to stay. I stood at the kitchen window watching it fall, the way I used to watch Eric wait for the school bus. The world felt paused. Not empty. Just still. That morning I didn't turn on the radio. Didn't heat the kettle. I sat in the silence and let the house breathe with me. I lit a fire in the stove, wrapped a blanket over my lap, held a warm mug and let stillness fill the room. No sadness. No joy. Just a kind of peace that didn't come from fixing anything, but from knowing I didn't have to anymore. Later I wrote a letter, not to Eric. Not to Frank. To the woman I used to be. The one who thought love meant saying yes, who believed staying quiet kept things safe. I wrote softly. Told her she didn't have to carry it all anymore. That she could finally rest. The weight had gone far enough. I folded the letter and tucked it into a book I never finished. Some stories don't need endings. They just need release. That evening I baked a small cake, just one layer just for me. I lit a single candle and placed it in the center. No one sang. No one clapped. I closed my eyes and made a wish, not for anyone else but for my own stillness. My own beginning. A life that didn't need to prove itself anymore. I opened my eyes and blew out the flame. The room didn't feel quiet. It felt earned. If this story stirred something quiet in you, something you haven't spoken out loud in years, just know, you're not alone. Every woman who's ever felt invisible still carries a fire that cannot be taken. And if you've ever walked away from something that once defined you only to find your own voice waiting on the other side, I hope you hold that voice gently. And if you ever feel like telling your story, even a small part of it, I'm here. Because sometimes being heard is the first step back to being whole.